You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. Welcome back to Season 5 of Storytime in Paris. I have an excellent season lined up for you, if I do say so myself, and I'm delighted to introduce our season premiere guest, 22-time Sunday New York Times Top 10 multi-million bestseller, Adele Parks. Adele's work has been translated into 31 languages, and, as if that weren't enough, Her Majesty the Queen granted her the honor of MBE for services to literature in the New Year Honors List 2022. Adele's latest novel is One Last Secret, a psychological thriller told from the perspective of a high-end sex worker who takes one last job before hanging up her garters for good. It's about power, sex, money, and revenge, and is filled with fabulous twists and turns. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Adele Parks, author of One Last Secret. Hello, Adele. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My absolute pleasure, Jennifer. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. And this is our season premiere back on Storytime in Paris for Season 5. And I'm so honored that you are my guest.
Oh, thank you. No, honestly, honor's all mine. How exciting. Also, it's so funny just hearing the word Paris. Do you know what I mean? You're invited to be on a podcast with the word Paris and you go, yeah, absolutely. it just conjures up so much fun and excitement and beauty and romance. And yeah, why wouldn't you? So it's my pleasure.
That's wonderful. That's good to know. I guess I did a good branding thing there when I threw Paris in.
100%.
It's true. Everyone has their own version of Paris, but it's pretty much always something that you want. So
yes,
that's good. So before we get too far into this, can you tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. So I'm a novelist. So Adele Parks, a novelist. I was born in North Yorkshire in the UK. Over the last 22 years, I've written 22 times top 10 best-selling novels, which is a tongue twister and also a great joy and privilege because it has always been my childhood dream to be a writer. And how many of us, get to say my dreams came true, and they have. So that's marvelous. I have written in lots of different genres, but the last sort of 6 or 7 books have been psychological thrillers, which is a tremendous genre to write in. I very much enjoy it. And yeah, I love the twists and turns. I love the darkness to all that. So yeah, lots of fun.
I love reading it, so this works out perfectly.
Wonderful.
Can you tell me, do you have a connection to Paris or to France yourself?
Do you know, I do have one to France because, and this is going to sound so flash, we used to own a chateau in France. I know, doesn't that sound great? Except it's that we used to own. So about 10 years ago, my husband and I impulse purchased a chateau, which sounds so ridiculous. I mean, most people impulse purchase like a Hershey bar or something, not a chateau. But it was basically that. We had just built our own house here in England and finished it. And I think what sensible people would have done is taken a breath and enjoyed that. But we were still on that sort of high of what can we do next? And we saw in a newspaper this sort of ramshackled place in France that needed a lot of TLC. And we bought it as a project. And indeed, when we bought it, it's near Toulouse in the south of France, and it didn't have a kitchen or bathrooms. It was literally sort of, it was a Parisian family who used it as their summer house. And they had old-fashioned chamber pots under their beds. They didn't even have proper bathrooms. They had 2 loos, but that was literally it. But no showers, nothing like that. So we renovated it and made it absolutely beautiful. And it was really glorious to own and have for about just under a decade. But ultimately, because of Brexit and COVID and one thing and another, we actually sold last year, and it is now back in the hands of a French family, which I think is lovely. It's how it should be, although I do miss it tremendously because I do love France.
What a nice story, though. I mean, not the chamber pot part, but the rest of it.
I know. And you know how, as we were saying, the Parisians are so chic and fabulous. And we kept sort of saying to this family we're buying off, how do you manage? And they were just like, well, very French about it. And obviously, they would live a very sophisticated life in the rest of the year when they were in Paris, but they just kind of accepted that's what they did in the country. And and they had these chamber pots. And so when we were looking around, and I was kind of waiting to see where are the bathrooms. I mean, it would horrify Americans because, I mean,
yes,
you're even more about everything being absolutely beautiful and clean and all the rest of it. But even as British people, we were sort of wandering around going, this is a bit rustic and I don't know if I can put up with this. Anyway, by the time we left, it had 6 bathrooms and it had a lovely kitchen. So it was all good.
Much better.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to tell me a little bit about the plot of One Last Secret, your latest novel. But I'm curious now that you just said that, is the chateau in this book based on your chateau?
Well, yes. Yes, it is. I mean, that's the thing. One Last Secret is the story of an escort, a sex worker, which is quite a shocking start to any explanation of a novel, because in most psychological thrillers, there quite often is a sex worker, but she's usually already dead in the background somewhere, God love her, or a nameless, faceless person sort of bending round a pole or sat on somebody's lap. She doesn't have a voice of her own. And that has started to bother me over a few years of reading psychological thrillers and crime books. And so I purposely gave my sex worker the narration. Dora is the woman we are fighting for and with, and we have her voice with us. But she isn't necessarily somebody who makes great choices. Let's be honest. You don't end up becoming a sex worker if you've made great choices in life. So we do hear about her background, which perhaps gives us context that makes us more empathetic towards her. But one of the things that I find quite frustrating about her, bearing in mind I created her, is the beginning of the novel, she gets this opportunity to give up her work because she has met somebody and she's in love with him and he wants to marry her, but only on the proviso that she stops working as an escort instantly, which I think any man would say to his partner. And she agrees, but then she gets offered one lucrative last job. And it doesn't have to be physical. It's she has to go along and pretend with an old client of hers, a trusted client, that she's a girlfriend, and she has to pretend it to his group of friends. And she has to do this in the south of France, and she can't resist. She goes. And you might at that point be crying out, don't do it, Dora. And you'd be absolutely right. But anyway, where she goes is this very beautiful chateau in the south of France. And yes, I did very much physically base it on my own chateau that we had renovated, which was just kind of my love story to it in a way, that the way of sort of saying goodbye to it, I think, and immortalizing it for me. But yeah, she goes to this chateau and it's isolated, which actually ours wasn't particularly isolated, thank goodness. But her chateau is isolated. And unfortunately, because it is a psychological thriller, nothing is as it seems in her chateau. Mine was very lovely, where I spent lots of birthday parties and summers with friends, I hasten to add. Her experience is not the same.
Good. I'm very happy.
Good that my experience wasn't like hers, because hers is awful, isn't it?
Yes. But I do feel like I really understand where you lived, though, because the way that you write the chateau is very evocative. Like I can picture it very clearly.
Yes, I'm so glad, because it really is a beautiful part of the world. And actually, I wrote this book during lockdown. And, we were all aching to travel, weren't we? And to see things that were different to the four walls that we were living in. And I wanted to take everybody to my beautiful chateau. So I'm glad that comes across. And I think France has just got that, well, it's got that je ne sais quoi, hasn't it? That, there's no other word for it. There's something we all don't have that we all want to buy into. And so I am very pleased with my setting.
So I want to go back to something you said before. You said you've written 22 books in 22 years. How is that possible? Do you have a very specific writing regime? How do you do this?
I do have quite a strict writing regime. I think how it's possible is, first of all, I love it. I love writing. Writing and then next reading are my absolute passions. And in fact, if I'm not writing, I start to get a bit edgy. We've just come through the holiday season, and I know I'm kind of a bit over the holiday season. By about the 27th of December, I'm sort of desperate to get at my desk, and I'm having to sort of smile and wave at relatives at that point and watch rubbish on television when all I want to do is pick up a book and go back to my office and write my own book. But I am very disciplined. I do realize it's not just about sitting and waiting for the muse. It's very much, for me now, wasn't originally, obviously a bit trial and error at the beginning, but now it's very much a kind of honed process. So I know that during the week, Monday to Friday, I write 1,000 to 2,000 words every day. And that over a period of 6 months will get me a novel, even with heavy self-editing, which I do heavily self-edit as I go along. Even before I start the 1,000 to 2,000 words, I have two major sort of hurdles to jump. The first is plot. I tend to write my plot on a spidergram, and I put that together very, very early days. I have a sort of central character, and then the people are coming off and the things that are happening, and it's all colors and crazy, and it works for my brain, but doesn't work for anyone else's, I suppose. And then the second thing is characters. I have a process where I interview my characters, and I have a whole host of set questions that a lot of them are very obvious set questions that we obviously need, name, age, sexuality, gender, nationality, perhaps. But then there's a lot more. That's facts about people. It's not really character about people. So I will also interview my characters and want to know, what's the moment you're most proud of in your life? What's the moment you're most ashamed of? Do you have a secret? Who's your favorite person on earth? Should it be that person? Are you anybody else's favorite person on earth? And all sorts of, I might ask my character what their birth sign is, which is insane in some levels, but it's for me to very tightly get to know my characters. And so I work on character and plot sort of September to Christmas. And then now in January, I start writing the book. And then by about the summer, it's done, and that's the process, which is really handy because then in the summer, I usually am promoting or traveling somewhere.
Fabulous. It's very interesting.
And I think people sort of say, well, how do you keep going? And I think, what would I do if I stopped? I think genuinely, it's only self-diagnosis, but I think everyone agrees with me. I am a workaholic, and I'm lucky that I enjoy my work. So I do have this edgy feeling when I'm not working, and people say often, what will you do if you run out of ideas? And I'm much more concerned about running out of time. I feel I have a lot of ideas, but I'm concerned about running out of time. And I think the other thing is I've got such amazing, loyal, fabulous readers that have come along. Many of them have come along for the 22 years. Some I'm discovered me last week. But whoever they are, once they're into my work, they kind of go, what's next? And so there's a contract, isn't there, between, if you enjoy my work, I promise I'll keep producing. So that's great.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know you've written in other genres. You said your last 6 or 7 books are in this psychological thriller genre. How did you come to this? And how did you know that you had a talent for it?
It's almost back to front, because I started with romantic comedy. And I started with that because actually I was going through a period of profound grieving. I was in my late 20s, and we lost a number of family friends and family in a relatively short period of time. And I went to a grief therapist, and she suggested to me that I find something that I enjoy doing, that I am in control of, because the whole point of grief is things happen to you that you can't control, but you can control your reaction to it. And she said, it could be baking cakes, being in the garden. And I eventually admitted, I do this scribbling. And I used to want to be a writer. And at that time, I worked in marketing. And she said, well, what do you mean scribbling? And I sort of produced these huge notebook full of my writing. And she said, how many of those have you got, Adele? And I said, I don't know, about 20. She said, there might be a little bit more to this than scribbling. So I started writing a very funny book to take me out of myself, actually, which is quite unusual because a lot of people, their first novel is about their own experiences. But mine wasn't. It was about this woman who had literally everything. just got married, had a great friendship group, beautiful wardrobe of clothes, had a laugh, did have a really, really sleazy, fantastically exciting affair. All of these things that were just quite sort of fanciful. And it did incredibly well. That was in the year 2000, and it became the debut bestseller of 2000. And so I got that contract for that kind of novel. And I wrote romantic comedies for 6 or 7 years. And then I was a little bit older. I had perhaps a bit more I wanted to say, or even I wanted to say things in a different way. And so I started writing more sort of relationship dramas, getting a little bit darker. But I couldn't sort of shake off this public mantle of being a romantic comedy writer, in my PR, etc. Because actually I had been very successful, which was a lovely thing. But it became difficult to change genre. So I completely changed and wrote 2 historical novels set in World War I. 4 years research. As I was researching, I was still writing the romantic comedies, but I completely changed. And there obviously, one book was about sort of spare women. It's called Spare Brides. It's about the spare women because there were so few men left after the war in comparison to women of marrying age. And the other was about a conscientious objector. So very deep stories. And so they sort of got noticed by broadsheets rather than tabloids. The reviews were different. The critical acclaim was different. And so after I'd written those 2 stories, I didn't want to go back to romantic comedy, but also I sort of couldn't because I'd tortured my characters and I put them through emotional traumas, and 45,000 men had died before breakfast in one of my books. So, I couldn't go back to being the sort of brighter end.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
So sort of psychological thrillers came to me because I wanted to write. I'm very interested in where we are now, which I think does come from where we've been in our histories. But I wanted to write about the contemporary society we're in now. I keep some of my sense of humor that's been in the early books. I think that threads through. But I wanted to look at the dark side. And it just sort of grew. The story grew before I knew what I was doing. I sort of gave the book to my editor and she said, "Oh, so now you're writing psychological thrillers." And I said, "Am I?" So I think it was more a process of sort of writing the books I wanted and then the market finding, "Oh, you're this now."
Okay, very interesting.
Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, but it was very interesting. It's interesting to hear the evolution and the path of how it happened, especially because logically to go from romantic comedies to psychological thrillers, it's not, it's sort of a disconnect.
Correct. And because I was feeling my most down when I wrote romantic comedies, and now I'm, luckily, touch wood, a very happy human being. I'm very established. And so I think I dare go to the dark side without feeling threatened. So I can allow my psyche to sort of explore really dreadful things without thinking, goodness, this might happen, or am I manifesting this? Or I don't feel afraid when I'm writing those things. But when I was younger and starting out and had sort of sad things going on in my real world, I know I didn't allow myself to have those thoughts because I thought I'd be swallowed by them. So I think there is something really interesting about the kind of flip of what I'm writing to what I'm feeling.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so let's talk about one last secret. I was going to ask you why you made Dora a sex worker, but I think you talked a little bit about that already. One thing that I think is really interesting, I read a lot, but I don't think I've ever read anything where the main character was a sex worker before. And I've certainly seen it in TV and in film and all of that, but I feel like typically these sex workers fall into one of 2 categories. Either there's someone who's down in their luck, who we're supposed to be a bit above, we're looking at the bad choices that she's made and we're judging her and, we're above her. Or it's someone who is very titillating, very erotic, and someone that we're meant to sort of hypersexualize. And what I loved so much about your book, I loved many things, but one of the things I loved so much was that she is this high-end sex worker, but she's neither someone to be judged and pitied, nor is she someone for us to like get off on as we're reading.
Yes, thank you. That's the hugest compliment I could possibly hope for. When I wrote her, the first thing is I did interview sex workers.
Oh.
So I know, because it's not what you expect in a lady novelist's life, is it? But I thought with anything else I've ever written about, whether that was alcoholism or being in prison or whatever, I've done the real life research because it's essential. I feel that if I'm asking people to commit their time, which I think is the most precious commodity we have, to reading one of my novels, I don't want to let them down. I want it to be as truthful as possible, as thought-provoking as possible, and as entertaining as possible. And I think all of that comes from it being honest. So my research is very, very important to me. So yes, I Googled sex workers near you, which is an extraordinary thing to have on your Google search. But anyway, turns out, and I live in a very nice town, I hasten to add, sex workers are everywhere. And that was my first sort of take a deep breath. They might be walking down your street right now. You know, they are not different. I mean, they're different because it's not what we do for a job, but they're like us in many ways because they have a job and they have commitments and they pay mortgages or rents and they might have families and all that sort of thing. Anyway, I had 3 that I interviewed, and many of the conversations were sort of exactly like the kind of conversations I would have with other school mums, for instance. You know, quite normal. And then others, they would just sort of blow my mind thinking, gosh, that's so shocking. I can't believe you just said those words out loud in a cafe, you know, that sort of thing. But it helped me understand that these women were textured and layered and as interesting as any other woman or human anywhere. And I realized that was what I wanted to get over. And yes, it's quite a hard sell. If I remember telling my editor, you know, I'm going to do it from the sex worker's point of view. And also I sort of avoid being in the bedroom with her, which you know because you've read it. I purposely didn't want to have too many sexual graphic scenes. It wasn't really about what she does in the bedroom. We're all aware what happens in bedrooms. It was more what happens in her head that I thought was more interesting. So once I'd made that decision not to describe sexual act after sexual act after sexual act, which I think could so easily be what somebody expects when they hear this book narrated by a sex worker. Once I'd made the decision to sort of leave that behind and her leave her job behind, but what were the consequences of her having this job in the first place, I knew I was onto something. And I love the fact that you say you haven't read this particular situation before, because how exciting for us all to increase our empathy, to understand a different situation, because it's a tough job, you know. Nobody would want to do it, really, would they?
Yeah. And she's a real person in this book. She's a real human being. She's not someone for us to categorize in some sort of way. She seems like a real 3-dimensional human.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thank you. But she addresses the audience a number of times in the book, and she does it in a way that's almost confrontational. She says, you know, you probably assume I want to be rich, and you think it gives you the right to judge me. Why did you choose to have her address the audience so directly in this way?
Because I do think reading is very much a personal dialogue between, well, at one level between the reader and the writer, but actually probably at a deeper level between the reader and the characters. And I knew she was unsympathetic. I know that, you know, I know when I met the sex workers I did meet to interview, I know I felt slightly on edge. I felt quite nervous. It wasn't a situation I ever imagined myself in. I was nervous of saying the wrong thing. I think I did arrive with preconcepts of what they might be like. And some of the things that I imagined about them were true, and some of the things I imagined were not true. And then there were some things that I just hadn't considered at all. And so, the one thing I did notice with all 3 women that I interviewed, they already seemed to know what I was thinking. And I suspect they knew that because they meet so many people and they are constantly judged. And that came up in their conversations. And they said, oh, I know you'll be thinking, why couldn't I have done this, that, or the other instead? And I heard this, as they were doing this, I thought, oh, yes, that's the voice that they already are a step ahead, because these women do have to be a step ahead because they're actually perpetually in danger. And I mentioned this thing that I do where I interview my characters. And one time when I was like playing with Dora and interviewing her before I started writing her, I said to her, "Oh, and so what's the moment you're most ashamed of, Dora?" And she just snapped back at me in my head, "We don't know each other well enough yet. I'm not telling you." She swore as well. I won't do that on the podcast. It's very rude. But she did. And I thought, oh, wow, there's the voice. It just came to me. I thought, there's the voice. She doesn't want to play with me. She won't do what I want her to do. She is always going to be a bit prickly. And that's because of how she's been treated. And I think in life that's so true. Some of the most prickly people are the people who have been ill-treated. Not always. Some prickly people are just annoying. But some prickly people are that because they sort of have their spikes out hoping not to be hurt. And that was the vibe that she has. And I think it was interesting that you know, I think you probably felt quite involved because she addressed you and quite invested. And that's what I hoped would happen.
That'll make sense too, because she is someone who is used to playing up to other people's expectations. Anyway, that's her job. Her job is to embody whatever character there is. So if you want to get to know who she actually is, you need to know who she actually is and away from these characters that she's playing.
Yes, exactly. And she sort of had a freedom when she talks to us as readers that she doesn't have when she talks to anybody else. And you see that as the reader. You see how she plays other people compared to how brutally honest she is with us.
The structure is also really interesting in this book. So most of it is from her perspective, but we do from time to time get a chapter from someone else's perspective. We do end up going back in time. We also end up going in the future. Can you talk a little bit about how this structure evolved, or was it always meant to be like this?
I always wanted it to mostly be her point of view and her first person, because I felt that was the way that I would retain sympathy for her the most. But that's quite an unusual decision for me, because I mostly write from multiple viewpoints, largely because I think there's something really exciting to be said for the fact that none of us have the same viewpoint, and like two people can witness the same event and see it very differently. And this book looks at that. I mean, partly it looks at it because there's aspects of gaslighting in this book, but it also looks at it on a very straightforward point of view where, you know, people remember things differently. Something that's incredibly profound to one person might be a brief encounter to another person, and yet it is the same encounter. And I think the only way I could explain that or investigate that was by looking at other people's viewpoints. And also, interestingly, it added to her isolation, because seeing how she views things, and you get embroiled in her voice and her viewpoint, and then you suddenly are taken out and you hear from ex-lovers or her mother or her current lover, and they see things so differently. And you realize that there's this disconnect between her experiences and other people's experiences. And I think we all have that to an extent. And I think it's really interesting to investigate. The going back in the past thing, I absolutely needed people to understand her past, but I didn't want to do it in a linear way. I didn't want it to be a sort of almost saga of, oh, look, this happened to me and this is where I ended up. Because that's not how we meet people. When we meet people, we meet them as they are now. And if they begin to trust us, they let us into their pasts. And so her situation is similar to that. When she's with the reader, as she trusts, we're allowed to go back into her past.
So you mentioned before you have this like spidergram way of working. There's so many twists in this book. And even when I thought the twists were over and the book was finished, there were more twists. So how many of these twists do you know before you start writing, and how many of them come from the writing itself?
I would say I always know the end.
Okay.
So I always know, because I think that helps each word work harder if you know where it's ultimately going. It's like setting off on a journey and knowing your ultimate destination, but I don't always know which route I'm going to take. I would say I probably know 70% of my twists. I have a very sort of natural, organic way of thinking, right now there needs to be a surprise. And it just sort of writes itself for me. And then on other times, I absolutely know oh, this is definitely going to happen and this is going to confuse things. And sort of at the beginning of the book, it's hard to give specific examples without spoiling anything. And I don't want to spoil anything. But at the beginning of the book, I knew, I would say 70% of the twists that were going to happen. And then some of them even surprised me.
I love that. Are you searching for spiritual guidance? The Heart of You podcast is an exploration into your soul through intuition, spirituality, divination, and unconditional love. Host Annette Deleu is a spiritual guidance coach, intuitive, Akashic, and tarot reader who discusses practical ways to integrate spiritual growth into your everyday life. Listen now to The Heart of You on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So speaking of this book, can we perhaps hear a little bit of it?
Oh, we can. I was thinking I would read from the beginning because I feel that's very Dora. Yeah, so it's One Last Secret. So it's easy for you to read from the beginning as well because I don't need to give you too much context. But it is quite embarrassing because I've read this a few times and because it is in first person and because she's a sex worker, I'm absolutely convinced at some point there's going to be this terrible meme of me saying awful things and not having the context of this isn't me speaking, this is Dora speaking. But I will read you from Dora. No little girl grows up dreaming of becoming an escort, a sex worker, a whore. Keep that in mind. It's a job, right? A lot of people do difficult work and many don't like their jobs. That's a fact about being an adult. We suck it up for a myriad of reasons. Maybe because we can't think of anything else to do, or we don't believe there is anything else we could do, as we don't have qualifications or opportunities, or simply the energy to draft a new CV. We do, however, have rents or mortgages to pay, electricity, gas, and the lure of the local pub that sells a really average Chardonnay. So we need to make money. From time to time, miners, couriers, sous chefs, debt collectors, refuse collectors, truck drivers, labourers on building sites and care workers, list not finite, must all complain about the way they earn money. And they are entitled to. All those roles incorporate high-pressure deadlines and have low-income growth potential. I'm just saying, none of us lives in Disneyland. Okay, PR girls and the ones in marketing and events management, you might very well be all wide-eyed and incredulous at this moment. You might be insisting, but I love my job. Good for you. You will also be thinking it's not paid well enough. You will be planning on marrying someone rich if money matters to you, or living in rented accommodation all your life if it doesn't. If you are thinking of marrying someone rich to supplement your lifestyle, to allow you to continue to pursue your dream job, then you need to pause on that thought before judging me. Look, don't take offense. I'm not saying you're exactly like me. I'm just saying maybe none of us are a million miles apart. Telling it as it is a core skill of mine. If I ever had to write a CV, I'd include it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So based on your schedule, it seems like perhaps right now you're starting a new novel?
A new one. Yes. So actually, 2023, God, I keep forgetting what year we're in. 2023's book is all done and dusted. Oh. And actually, 2023's book came from my American fan base. Not even kidding. It's such an interesting story. So I wrote a book that in the UK is called Both of You, and in North America is called Woman Last Seen. And Woman Last Seen came out last year. And I did some fantastic online events. And a thing I love about North Americans is they genuinely engage and do talk to you about the books and the characters. And I got literally a couple of thousand, I think, messages saying, yay, then what happened? And we would like this to happen. And maybe this could happen. I've been thinking about so-and-so. And it really surprised me because the book had been out for 6 months in the UK. And I'd had maybe 3 messages asking that kind of question in the UK. So there's a definite difference in how the books are consumed. And I had never planned on writing a sequel. But I suddenly thought, you know what, if this many people are this impassioned and they are bothering to write to me, I kind of owe them to investigate it. So last year, I wrote the sequel to Woman Last Seen, and it's called Just Between Us, and that comes out this year. And I'm super excited to hear what everybody thinks about it. It was quite the intellectual challenge because it had to be standalone in case you hadn't read the first novel and you just came to it as a psychological thriller in its own right. But it had to offer a satisfying sort of next stage for the people who had read Woman Last Seen / both of you. So that was great fun. And I'm currently proofreading the proof copies right now. Nearly finished that, hope to finish that in the next day or so I can get cracking on writing 2024's novel. Yes, I'm speaking so slowly because I'm trying to work out what year we're in, because, that crossover when you're just getting used to what year you're in. But I can't wait. That's always such an exciting time when you start a new novel. So very much looking forward to that. I have it plotted. I know what happens. In fact, I'm in a really odd position at the moment because I also know what 2025's novel is. So I'm actually, nobody ever should wish away time, and I certainly am not wishing away time, but I feel quite buoyant about my writing schedule for the next year or so.
That's exciting.
It is. It's really exciting.
It's exciting for us too, because it means that we've got lots more to look forward to.
Thank you. That's really kind. I hope so.
So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with all of your fabulous writing?
Well, I love people talking to me, as I've just made clear. I really genuinely do respond. I don't have a PA that deals with any of this. Anyone who sends me a message, either on my Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, it will be me that responds. So the places to find me are, I have a website, which is adeleparks.com, and you can contact me there and sign up to my newsletter. I'm Adele_Parks on Instagram. I am Adele Parks Official on Facebook, and I'm Adele Parks on Twitter. So really easy to find. There's always competitions. There's always news. There's posts about my events and my Zooms and all that kind of thing. And that's half the joy for me, because writing, I mentioned, it was my dream and I'm super excited to be doing it, but it is quite an isolated job. So the fun of engaging with readers is really important to me. It's lovely.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Adele. It was wonderful speaking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Jennifer. What a lovely, lovely interview. And thank you for your time.
Thank you again to Adele Parks for being such an excellent season premiere guest. You can find Adele on Instagram at Adele_Parks, on Twitter at Adele Parks, and on her website at adeleparks.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with international best-selling author Dr. Caroline Kauke about her book, Mrs. Van Gogh. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. Please remember to rate and review us, and also tell a friend. The more people who know about this podcast, the more we'll be able to grow, and the more I'll be able to share fabulous books and their authors with you. Join the Storytime Book Club, which welcomes authors who have been featured on the podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio for more information. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next week, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.